Hey everyone, welcome to the show where we discuss current legal events and legal hot topics from the perspective of a seasoned attorney such as myself. So today we are going to be discussing Congress in chaos. And so if you are familiar with current events, then you probably noticed that our United States Congress was in a bit of disarray of sorts, relating to electing a speaker and therefore convening Congress. So for those of any of you that may not be familiar with how the process works, um, Congress was initially supposed to be convened on January 3rd at 12 p.m. However, before that can be done, there are some procedural matters that need to be addressed, and one such matter is electing a Speaker of the House and also electing a Speaker of the Senate. So the Senate convened without any issues. The issue is the House was unable, the majority party in the House, which is the Republican Party, so that's who we're going to be speaking about today, was unable to elect a speaker um, on its initial balloting effort. Ultimately, after uh, days and 15 or so ballots, a speaker was actually elected. But this event is symptomatic of an issue that is plaguing our political system and also our entire legal system as a whole, which is this somewhat, for lack of a better word, and a word that actually came up is dysfunctional. Um, is that this dysfunction where things don't work the way that they're supposed to work. And one reason is because people don't use the procedures that are in place and then don't use those, or even if they do use the procedures, sometimes they use the procedures inappropriately. In any event, what we're going to be doing today is talking about this this unfortunately prevalent theme in our legal and political system today, which is just this dysfunction and a little bit of chaos. All right. So, with that being said, let's just go ahead and get right into it. So, initially, our House of Representatives was scheduled to convene at 12 p.m. on January 3rd, 2023. However, due to for a multitude of reasons, which we will discuss in just a few moments, the House was unable to convene on the 3rd. It wasn't until January 7th, and after at least 15 balloting initiatives, that a speaker was finally elected. And so um, this is interesting, and not only interesting, problematic because of the magnitude of the implications. So, if the House doesn't convene, that means that the House is not going to be in session. That means the House can't make any laws. It can't. Um, it can't engage in any of its typical duties and functions. None of the members of Congress were able to be sworn in. Um, if there was any type of emergency relating to national security, none of the lawmakers in our House of Representatives would have been able to respond, which is problematic because the way our system is set up. Um, Typically, if there is an issue, it usually requires multiple sections. So you'll have Congress and you'll have the president typically acting together when there is some type of national security crisis, and Congress has two parts. There's the Senate and there's the House of Representatives. So even though the president was in office and the Senate was in session, the House of Representatives was not in session. So had some type of national security issue arisen in that 4-day time period, unfortunately it didn't, but if it had, that could have been catastrophic, because there likely would have been um, a lot of difficulty in being able to respond and act in a timely manner because one piece of the puzzle that is required to cause our government to work and function as intended was actually missing. Um, and then, like I said, no rules, no bills, no resolutions, no laws, nothing could be passed while the House was not convened. So then the question becomes, well, why did this happen? And there's a lot of reasons that people are giving, but if we get past those superficial reasons, which is, oh, well, we were just exercising our right to engage in discussion and whatever the case may be, the issue becomes that if Congress is supposed to be convened on January 3rd, and it has been convened on January 3rd for the better part of a century, the last time that the House did not convene on its scheduled date, I should say, not necessarily January 3rd, but its scheduled date to convene, was more than a century ago. And that's because there's proper procedure and function. So what we saw here is dysfunction. We're going to get into what that means in a moment. But first, before I even get to that point, I want to talk a little bit about where the dysfunction arose. And so I have here causation. So whenever we are looking at what caused something, lawyers refer to that in and of itself as causation. And so these are just some of my thoughts about causation. These are not assertions that you should hold as true. These are just my personal thoughts on it. And so it seems that dissension might be one of the causes. And dissension just means that people just not being able to get along, and not for any particular purpose, just not getting along for the sake of not getting along. Instead of typically when you have a democratic body, which Congress in and of itself is a democratic body because it's part of our democratic government. Um, you need to have a reconciliatory demeanor. You need to have instead of having a competitive demeanor, which means you are more prone to be standoffish or disagreeable. You should have more of a reconciliatory, also known as diplomatic demeanor, which encourages people being able to work together to get things done. If you have a group of people who are just saying, hey, unless you do what we want, nothing's going to get done. If anyone who's ever worked in a legal setting knows that under those circumstances, typically nothing gets done. Uh, because there's a certain degree of compromise that is built into the way our legal system functions. Because without compromise, there is no democracy. Everybody has to work together. And in order to work together, that typically means some people will get some of what they want and some people will get some of what they don't want. It's rare that you see the case where everyone gets exactly what they want, because that's not how a democracy functions. That is more characteristic of a or tyrannical or totalitarian type of government, where you just have one person who says, hey, this is what we're going to do, and that's the end of it. That's typically the only way you have a governing body where everyone gets what they want, because usually there's no everyone, it's just one person. So then we're going to look at the next factor, which is opposition instead of compromise, which we really just talked about. We have incivility instead of civility. And In the legal setting, civility is very important because if you do not behave in a civilized manner, it can get people's tempers up. And when people's tempers flare, a lot of work doesn't get done. So again, that goes back to that whole concept of diplomatic. A diplomatic demeanor is a civil demeanor and a conciliatory demeanor. Um, Also, one thing I really want to point out is fear instead of faith. So, honestly, I think when you see people holding out and not being able to get along, dissenting over reasons that we'll see in a few moments, don't really have a lot of policy implications. Those type of factors or those type of issues, if you want to call them that, um, typically you're coming from a place of fear, not a place of faith. And when I say faith, faith, at least faith in the, if you don't have faith in anything, have faith in our system instead of you put fear first. Fear that the system won't work, so you won't participate. That kind of seems like what was happening here, at least for that small faction, which is a little bit alarming, considering the fact that our country has been running very smoothly for centuries using the same system. So we know that it works. It may need to be tweaked, it may need a few corrections, or it may need to be smoothed out a little bit here and there. But as a general rule, the system does work. We also see as our next factor selfish, self-serving behavior instead of humanitarian. And what I mean by that is that honestly, because we are next going to look at some of the things that this faction was holding out about. And honestly, it seems more selfish and self-interested instead of humanitarian, which would mean for the people. And this is alarming and extremely concerning for the fact that the House of Representatives exist for one purpose, and that is to represent the will of the people. So when you see uh, any faction of members of the House of Representatives who are seeking self-serving or taking self-serving positions over a humanitarian position, that means they're exalting themselves over the will of the people. And that's problematic. That also can be seen by the fact that when these implications that we just discussed, the implications were devastating. If anything had have happened, the people would have been in jeopardy. You and I, the people, because 20 or so people decided that they wanted to put their put their interest above everyone else's, wanted to exalt their interest above the interest of the people that they represent. And these are things we need to take into consideration when we vote. Okay, so maybe we hadn't had an opportunity to see this type of behavior before, but I will submit to you that we actually had. And the people, may have been asleep at the wheel a little bit. So this is our call to wake up, pay attention, so that when we do go and vote, we vote for people who are going to work for the people and actually do the will of the people. You can't tell. It is easy to tell on some of these issues, and we're going to have this discussion a little bit more in a few minutes. Um, it's become very clear what the people want on certain types of issues. And what we'll see is that certain factions or certain members seem to, again, instead of going with the will of the people, they go with their own self-interest. That you don't have to take my word from it. We'll see in just a few moments. Okay, so then we have what I call takers instead of providers. So of Congress are what we would refer to as civil servants. They are supposed to serve the people. But instead of serving the people, as I just said, it seems that they are trying to maybe garner a position so that they can seek self-serving interest. That's, again, we're going to talk a little bit about why I see that when I look at this situation. And last, we have bullies instead of peacekeepers. So again, when you have a democratic body, you need to have a diplomatic demeanor. When you have people who just don't want to get along for the sake of not getting along, and again, we'll discuss this in just a few minutes. I have examples. That's someone that's being a bully instead of a peacekeeper. When you are a diplomat, I hate to say it, but part of your job is keeping the peace. If we had diplomats who were bullies, we would be at war all the time, right? So again, you're seeing character traits in a democratic body that requires diplomacy that are the antithesis of diplomacy. And I submit that that is one reason why we have dysfunction and chaos in that body. Is it alive? And we've talked a little bit about dissension, a little bit about opposition simply for the sake of opposition, and dissension simply for the sake of dissension, not necessarily relating to a policy issue of importance or any type of substantive issue at all sometimes. We've talked a little bit about incivility, a little bit about self-serving behavior versus behavior that is geared towards the people as a whole. And unfortunately, a little bit, sometimes it seems that there's a little bit of more of what we attorneys call a competitive stance, but what lay people will really refer to as, bullying, where some people just say, hey, you either do it my way or we're not gonna get on board with the program, which is somewhat of what lawyers and negotiators what call a competitive stance instead of a reconciliatory or a conciliatory stance. But again, what lay people would really will refer to being more of a bully than rather a peacekeeper. And while we don't want people to be pushovers, we definitely need people to be more willing to collaborate and work together for the good of all of us versus some people stand up for their own good and for their own sake and for their own positions, because that's not what the House of Representatives was created for. It's created to represent the will of the people, not the will of a handful of representatives. And so this concludes part one of a series that I'm calling Congress and Chaos. Now, in part two, we're going to look at some of these characteristics and these behaviors and look a little bit further, though, and look at some of the legislation that is being produced in this, what I am terming somewhat of a chaotic environment, and look at some of the legislation that's being produced and discuss whether that legislation is contributing to our democratic institutions and furthering our democratic institutions, or maybe detracting from the institution, and whether this legislation is effectively doing what is required, which is actually causing our government to run. Is our government running in an effective manner? And again, that's getting at the heart of the issue, which is this environment a little bit chaotic? So if you're interested in this topic, then stay tuned, and I'll see you in our next episode, which is Congress and Chaos, Part 2. So, in summary,